Well, Mother, what do you think about the
We
foundation?
came here about 3 years ago. We found the buildings were too small to enable us to become a properly enclosed carmel.
Medieval nuns were noted to be dedicated to God, as well as their promise of a lifelong vow of solitude, chastity, and obedience. But what were some things being a medieval nun that might be concerning? Like how becoming a nun means sacrifice, women in the Middle Ages didn't have the same rights as men, nor did they earn or commanded respect unless they were born from a noble family. So many medieval women found themselves in the covenant as a part of a form of relief from restricted life. In other words, there's a chance that she found solace in the eyes of God and wanted to devote her life with the like-minded women. Or their family wished for her to become a nun and she was not allowed to have a say in the matter. This was also sometimes being a nun allowed the daughter access to have education, but the families were not able to afford it, as most monasteries and nunneries had libraries and were also opted to be the teachers to children and among of one another. At the initial stages during the early medieval times, the medieval nuns belonged to the Benedictine Order, which was established by Saint Benedict in 529 AD. With the passage of time, various new orders of medieval nuns were established. A medieval nun, by definition, was a member of a female religious order who was bound by certain vows that acted as requirements of the order. These vows for a medieval nun was including poverty, chastity, and of course obedience. Other than serving other human beings, medieval nuns also led a life of asceticism in monasteries or covenants. The status of a medieval nun during the medieval ages was higher than the ordinary woman, and although not higher than the women of nobility, it's still pretty prevalent. A nun was expected to wear simple clothing as a symbol of shunning her worldly goods and distractions. The long tunic was typical attire with the veil to cover all, but the face was a symbol of her role as a bride of Christ. The veil hid the nun's hair, which had to be kept cut short, as nuns often had their hair cut and or also tonsured, and this was also the most drastic part of the deciment process. In the medieval period, hair was an important sign of social status, ethnic identity, age, and sex, and nuns could not leave their nunnery and contact with outside visitors, especially men, which was kept to an absolute minimum. Even so, there were cases of scandal, such as in the mid-12th century CE at the Gilbertine Wotton Abbey in England, where a lay brother had an intimate physical relationship with a nun, and on discovery of the sin was castrated. A common punishment of the period for non-consensual intimate relationships was made, although in this case, this relationship was to be consensual. The medieval nun who spent her life in community service did not have a permanent abode. She could live in different monasteries and convents. However, a medieval nun who had devoted her life to prayer and meditation generally spent her life inside a monastery or a convent and hardly ever left it. Leaving a religious vocation as a nun or sister is a deeply personal and complex decision. It's important to approach this process with sensitivity and care. Because of the unlikely chances a woman would leave the convent, especially in the Middle Ages, considering financially, the church or nunnery would be the one providing her all the sustenance. It would also be generally rare for a nun to leave. In addition, the process of leaving takes just as long as it is initiating yourself into becoming an official nun. The process varies in length, however, it does take between 6 to 12 years to fully complete, as there are vows she must take and abide by each year as she continues her journey into nunhood. The daily routine of a nun was much that of a monk. She was required to attend various services throughout the day and say prayers for those in the outside world. In particularly for those souls who have had made donations to the nunnery, generally the power of a nun's prayer was regarded as equally efficient in protecting one's soul as a monk's prayer was. Nuns also spent lots of time reading and writing and illustrating, especially small devotional books, compendiums of prayers, guides for religious contemplations, treatises on the meaning and relevance of vision experienced by some nuns, and musical chants. Consequently, many nunneries built up impressive libraries, and manuscripts were not just for internal readers, as many were circulated among priests and monks, and even lent to lay people in the local community. In some way, being a saint was a crucial identity to achieve enlightenment with God. Besides giving the alms, nuns often acted as tutors to children, and they looked after the sick, helped women in distress, and provided hospice service for the dying. Nunneries thus then tended to be more closely related to their local communities than male monasteries, and nunneries were often actually part of the urban settings and less physically remote places. So in the end, if you are becoming a nun, you're most likely to be completely isolated from the rest of the world. Consequently, nuns were perhaps more visible to the secular world than their male counterparts, as life was very repetitive and it was largely divided into different sections and sessions of scriptures, readers, prayers, and saving the souls of the lay community. In comparison to sisters versus nuns, as they are intertwined, a nun is cloister, whereas a sister are not. Many orders of the sisters, like friars, are often very active in their communities, working in such as nursing, teaching, etc., and sisters are usually very active in community voluntary work. Whereas nuns never really leave their monastery. In fact, they barely leave at all. You can barely see them too when you go to, let's say, the Vatican, and you try to give a donation, you won't be able to see them. They only have like a little eye slot thing at the door. The life of a nun is also usually much more austere, as nuns follow a very strict prayer routine, often meeting in community to pray 8 to 9 times a day, in addition to a much private prayer time and reading sacred scripture, including getting up at 3 a.m., where sisters still observe the liturgical hours, but usually not getting up at 2 to 3 a.m. to pray. Sisters typically spend around 4 to 5 hours to pray in prayer, where cloister nuns are more around 9 to 10 hours a day. Sisters fast, but nuns much more so, as the life of a nun is totally self-surrender and much daily penitence. In the medieval times, when you are a nun and typically respected being one, there are also off chances of raiders during the processes and complexities of war. And since most of the surrounding villages rely on the house of the sisters and nunnery for protection, it does also put the nuns at risk, not just in raiding, but in the danger of their dedication to their chastity, as there are unfortunate circumstances in history nuns become victims of casualties of war. Virginity was an integral part and requirement for a nun in the very early medieval period, because physical purity was considered the only starting point from which to reach spiritual purity. But what if you're a nun who couldn't help but fall in love? In 1627, a woman named Jane started feeling an attraction to a man called Urbain, but this was not just going to be a regular love story, as Jane de Agnes was the mother superior of the London monastery in southern France, and Urbain Garnier was actually the local priest. Jane faced her romantic feelings like it would have been expected from a nun, with denial and horror. She had devoted her entire life to a life of holiness, and yet, despite all of her efforts, she was unable to shake off her longing for Urbain. She later confessed in her autobiography, "When I did not see him, I burned with love for him, and when he presented himself to me, I lacked the faith to combat an impure thoughts and movement that I felt. Never had the demons created such a disorder in me, and apparently this exploded when the accusation of the priest ended up being a demon," which wasn't true, but they needed an excuse, and committed to notorious witchcraft. 3 nuns were declared possessed, and by December 1639, 9 were declared possessed, and 8 other obsessed. The first task of the exorcism was diagnostic, to identify the name of the devil of whom the demonic gave voice and to discover where in the body it resided. It became that the London possessions, and it resulted that priest of Urbain ended up being burned at the stake. But aside being too down bad for your local priest, or your hot priest, there was also an issue of covenant drama with nunneries. After all, nuns are humans, and like humans, we do have conflicts with one another based off of misunderstandings and inability to get along. Nuns are very cliquey and catty sometimes, and even retired nuns, also part of that group. It's also very sad to see sometimes, though, many of these sisters were alone in the world and only had each other to lean on, and it was heartbreaking to see ones that are left out because of something that she said or did. But of course, they do be back to each other in each other's graces quick enough. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you around. My name is Jess, and I wish you all the best. Medieval nuns were Oh. Oh, okay. Medieval nuns were noted to be dedicated to God, as well as their promise of a lifelong vow of solitude, chastity, and obedience. But what were some things being a medieval nun that might be concerning? And it's lunchtime, everyone's walking. Like how becoming a nun means sacrifice, women in the Middle Ages didn't have the same rights as men, nor did they earn or commanded respect unless they were born from a noble family. So many medieval women found themselves in the covenant as a part of a form of relief from restricted life. In other words, there's a chance that she found